What's going on, guys? We are back with some more breakdowns. We are coming off of a week hiatus from the UFC after one of the best, if not arguably the best card in UFC history, which was UFC 300. So it was a much needed break after all of that excitement. But this week we are back in the apex for UFC Vegas 91. And although it's not as exciting as UFC 300, we still get fights this weekend, so I am super stoked about it. Let's get into these breakdowns. Make sure to like and subscribe to get more content from this channel on UFC. Let's go ahead and start these breakdowns. First off, starting the afternoon off, because these are 4 p.m. Eastern time, we have Gabriel Benitez going up against Maheshate Hayisaer. Hayisaer? Don't know how to pronounce his name. Maheshate is how we're going to refer to him. So, my pick for this fight is going to be Maheshate. Now, despite his silver medal in Greco-Roman wrestling in Xinjiang, China, Jesus Christ, I couldn't get that out. He's yet to land a takedown under the UFC umbrella. He's had 4 fights, 1 on the Contender Series and 3 in the actual promotion. Now, that Dana White's Contender Series fight, he fought a 7-0 prospect who was undefeated, obviously, and he won by unanimous decision to get a contract with the promotion. Now, his UFC debut was in Singapore against Steve Garcia, where it was a really quick fight. I think it was under 2 minutes, where Maheshate landed 2 fat right hands, one to put Steve Garcia down, and the second one after he got up to leave him face first on the canvas and got that KO win. So a great start for him in the UFC, but since then he has struggled. He's dropped 2 fights in a row. He went up against Rafa Garcia after that Steve Garcia fight, where he found success. He was landing on Garcia and actually had him stunned early on in that fight. I think it was the first round. And then in the second, he was able to cut Rafa Garcia open, I believe, on the side of the head, and he was pouring blood. But unfortunately, his defensive wrestling was exposed in that fight. Rafa Garcia was able to notch 6 takedowns against Maheshate, which led to Maheshate losing that fight by unanimous decision. And in his most recent fight, he was knocked out in the second round against Vyacheslav Borshev. Now, I don't want to say I don't mind that loss against Borshev, but honestly, there's seldom amount of fighters in the UFC that will actually be able to stand with Vyacheslav Borshev. This guy is a former Russian and world kickboxing champion, and Maheshate is only 24 years old. He's kind of learning on the job here. Super young, has a lot of potential, and I think every single fight he has will gain him experience, and he will end up being better in his next outing. So honestly, I've noticed that he struggles when he's on the back foot. Most of his opponents have had success pushing, giving him giving him that pressure and pushing him up against the fence and being able to land on Maheshate that way. So hopefully he has worked on his lateral movement. He also struggles with leg kicks, and that takes me to the other side, which is Gabriel Benitez. He has solid leg kicks, so let's hope, because we're picking Maheshate, that he has addressed those leg kicks. But on the Benitez side, he's 35 years old. He is taking this fight on short notice. Maheshate was originally scheduled to fight Anshul Jubli, who withdrew from the fight. In comes Benitez. Now, at 35 years old, taking this on short notice probably isn't the best recipe for victory. He is 7-7 in the UFC, and looking back, all 7 of his wins are against opponents that are no longer in the UFC. So that's just something to take note. Now, he has a kickboxing style, but recently Benitez only seems to have a 1-2, and a leg kick. Which we already mentioned is going to be effective against Maheshate if he has not addressed that. But in this specific matchup, I'm going to choose the younger and faster fighter on the feet. This fight should mainly be a striking affair. So in that case, I will take the younger, faster fighter that has more arsenals, has more weapons in his arsenal, is what I'm trying to say. So my pick for this fight will be Maheshate. Let's move on to the next fight. Next up, we are in the women's flyweight division. We have Ivana Petrovic going up against Liang, and my pick is going to be Petrovic in this matchup. And the reason for that is you just can't trust Na Liang. You see that she has a 19-7 record, but that is absolutely inflated. Minus the first 5 fights of Na Liang's career, the remaining 21 fights, 12 of them, she's fought opponents that have 5 or fewer fights in their pro career. Not to mention her last win, which was outside of the UFC, so she's gone on a 3-fight losing streak in the UFC, but the win prior to entering the promotion, she defeated a debuting fighter. That's right. So she would have been 18-4 in that fight, and she was fighting a debuting fighter. All right. So that is typically the story of her inflated 19-7 record. She is an absolute wild animal. She'll pressure forward, swing wild punches, and try to get the fight to the ground. Typically, she loves that headlock, and that is not an effective takedown in the UFC. We know that it is very dangerous to try to go for those headlocks because as you have the fighter's head right here, if they're able to squeeze out, they automatically have your back. So that's not a particularly solid takedown technique, but Na Liang absolutely loves it. So she's going to want to wrestle. That's why she wings punches wildly, tries to get the fight to the ground. Now, Ivana Petrovic is going to have a kickboxing style. Now, but she also has a purple belt in BJJ. So if early on Na Liang is able to apply that wrestling pressure, I believe that the BJJ skills that Petrovic has will keep her safe enough where she's not going to get finished by Na Liang early on, where Liang is does provide the best fighting, I guess I should say. But typically, that's the story of Na Liang's career. She is super explosive and just absolutely wild in that first round. But then because of that output, she ends up fading in the second and third rounds, typically leading to her getting finished. So this is Petrovic's sophomore outing in the UFC. She made her debut against Luana Carolina, which she ended up losing. But although Carolina isn't like the top most skilled fighter, she is a tricky matchup. She has that weird kind of body, tall and kind of lanky, and it was just she's a tricky debut fight for any girl. And typically UFC debuts aren't don't portray the fighter's ability due to like nerves and all that stuff. So I am going to pick Petrovic in this fight. If Na Liang is able to find success, it will be early on, but that BJJ will help Petrovic on the ground. And I also don't mind her in bottom position because she doesn't accept it. She works to getting sweeps and getting back to her feet. She stays pretty active on her back as well. So I can see this being early Na Liang, and then Petrovic kind of weathering that storm. Na Liang tiring out as she usually does, and then Petrovic getting like a late second to third round TKO victory. So we are going with Petrovic. Let's move on to the next fight. We got a lightweight matchup now. I wasn't expecting to have to break down this fight because this is James Llontop's third opponent. He was originally supposed to fight Lando Jhonata, I believe, who withdrew, and then he was supposed to fight Gabe Green up until like 3 days ago, but then Gabe Green withdrew. So now I didn't expect James Llontop to actually have an opponent for this fight, but the UFC outsourced. They went with somebody not currently in the roster, in Chris Padilla, and they threw this match together. Now, I'm not going to act like I have a solid breakdown for this matchup. I'm really unfamiliar with Chris Padilla, but James Llontop, I did watch his Contender Series fight against Malik Lewis. He is 14-2. He has solid experience, and it was a dominant win on the Contender Series. He seemed pretty calm in the octagon there, so now that he's fighting another debuting fighter on short notice, I think the pressure is going to be a little bit less on his side because he's not going up against somebody like Lando Jhonata who has experience, or a Gabe Green that also has that experience. So I honestly cannot make an educated prediction in this matchup because of my unfamiliarity with Chris Padilla. But I've seen James Llontop fight. He's a solid fighter. I am going to go with him in this matchup, but this is based off of really not knowing much about Chris Padilla. All I know is that he had a fight scheduled with Uriah Faber's promotion a month from now, so he was training, but I don't know how he's going to, I don't know what opponent he was training for, what style, anything like that. I don't know where he's at with his body, with his weight. I just think the odds are stacked against him. I'm going to go with the solid choice of James Llontop. Not super confident because I don't know much about this Chris Padilla guy. So we're going to move on to the next fight, which is another women's fight. We got a strawweight bout, Marnic Mann going up against Ketlen Souza. Now let's scroll down a bit here. We got Souza. That's going to be my pick. She's going to be my pick, and I'm going to break down why. Former Invicta FC women's flyweight champion. Saying women's and Invicta is kind of redundant because Invicta is a pure women's MMA promotion. Regardless, she's the former flyweight champion in Invicta. She is coming off of a loss in her UFC debut against Karine Silva, who we will be breaking down later on in this video, but I give her a pass because Karine Silva is an absolute savage, but we will get to her later. Now, she's shown that she can be taken down and controlled on the mat, but something interesting is, though, that's typically up a weight class in flyweight and in bantamweight. Now, we are going to be in strawweight in this matchup, and that's another reason. It's going to be a few questions regarding the Souza side because she was finished by Karine Silva in her UFC debut by knee bar, and that thing popped out in that fight. So she's been off for about 10 months, I believe. It's going to be interesting to see how she comes back from that injury, how she deals with that 10-month layoff, and how she deals with going back down to 115. I truly believe that's more her natural weight class because she is a small girl, and she hasn't fought in strawweight in her past 7 fights dating back to 2020. So there are some questions on the Souza side, but I really don't think it's going to negatively impact her. Like I said, she's a pretty small girl anyway, so I think this is more her natural weight class. Now we go to the Marnic Mann side. Despite a little bit of a boxing background, she wants to wrestle when she gets into the octagon. She is 6-2, and despite being 3-0 in the LFA, which is that's kind of where the UFC finds a decent amount of their fighters, I should say. Regardless, she's undefeated in that promotion, but she's yet to find success under the UFC umbrella. She has 2 fights with the UFC, one on the Contender Series and the other in a UFC debut. So on the Contender Series, she actually went up against Bruna Brazil back in September 2022, and she was brutally head kick KO'd in that second round. So that was not a good look for Marnic Mann. And then more recently, back in September of 2023, I believe, she made her debut against Josephine Knudsen, another fighter from the Contender Series, and she was just absolutely dominated. Knudsen did everything but finish her in that fight. One judge gave Josephine Knudsen 3 10-8 rounds. One of the judges gave her 2 10-8 rounds. So it was pure and utter domination against Marnic Mann, and that's going to be one of the reasons why I pick against her. I think Ketlen Souza is going to have the advantage on the feet by far, and I think she has a competent enough ground game to compete with Marnic Mann if the fight gets down there, and I just don't think Marnic Mann is UFC caliber, so I'm going to go on the Ketlen Souza side. I think she's going to be able to I want to say dominate this fight just from watching Marnic Mann's previous 2 UFC fights. She is a tough girl, though. She's going to hang in there. She's not going to quit. So I'm not going to go Souza by finish. I will pick Ketlen Souza to win a unanimous decision victory against Marnic Mann. Next up, we have a sloppy heavyweight fight. And when we're breaking down these kind of heavyweight fights, technical analysis is not going to help our predictions. Okay, low-level heavyweight fights are almost impossible to predict, but this is a breakdown slash prediction video, so I'm gonna have to pick somebody, and I'm gonna go on the side of Caio Machado. Reason being is I don't think Dontel Mays is very good. Now, I don't think Machado's very good, but Machado's only 29 years old, and that is extremely young in the heavyweight division. We know as heavyweights, they can fight up to 40 plus years of age. So Caio Machado is very green in his heavyweight career, and he does show signs of potential. Now, he's supposed to have decent grappling. I haven't really seen much of it in his Dana White's Contender Series fight or his UFC debut, but he is supposed to have a decent enough grappling game, which is interesting because we don't typically see a lot of heavyweights being able to grapple. Technically, it's just swang and banging. His Contender Series fight, he went up against a Polish prospect. I believe he was Polish. 11-1, Kevin Szaflarski, where Machado was the underdog, and he kind of like made Szaflarski freeze up in that fight. I don't know what happened, but Kevin barely fought there, but Machado was able to get that win, dominant unanimous decision victory, which earned him his contract. And then he ended up dropping and losing his UFC debut against Mick Parkin, which watching that fight back, he arguably could have won, but it was a sloppy performance on both ends of that matchup. Now, if we're going to the Dontel Mays side, he's a big, powerful guy. He's 6'6". He has an 81-inch reach, and he's somebody that can put your lights out with a single strike. But he sometimes has low fight IQ. He's 10-6 with a 1-no contest in his career, and 3-4 with 1-no contest in the UFC. And if we're being perfectly honest, I'm not too impressed with his wins. He went up against somebody named Roque Martinez, who ended up being 0-3 in the UFC. He defeated Josh Parisian, very low level, arguably not even UFC caliber, somebody that the UFC used as a introduction to the promotion for new heavyweights on the come up. And I don't believe he's even in the UFC anymore. And his third win in the UFC is a 44-year-old Andrei Arlovski. And I understand it's Andrei Arlovski, tough veteran. The guy's been fighting for like 24 years in the UFC or something like that. Absolutely nuts. And one thing I will give him props for is a lot of heavyweights have gone up against Arlovski, even at this old age, and have had trouble finishing him, but Dontel Mays was able to put away Arlovski. So although it's not too impressive, kudos to him for being able to put him away. But like I said, there's really nothing you can break down technically to pick a side in this fight. You're better off just probably flipping a coin here. I expect this to be extremely sloppy, but I am going to side with Machado here because beyond a huge strike that puts Machado away, I think that Caio Machado is going to be the more active fighter. He's going to be in Mays' face, and he has shown signs of durability. He's only lost 2 fights in his pro MMA career, and both of them have been by decision. So I think Machado's going to give us more volume, going to give the judges more to score, and he has shown durability where I don't think Mays is going to be able to knock him out. Like I said, you're better off just flipping a coin. My pick here is going to be Caio Machado. Let's move on. Next up, we have a lightweight matchup against Austen Hubbard and Michal Figlak. And this is going to be a great fight in my opinion. Both of these fighters have a heavy pressure, in-your-face striking style, and they're both not afraid to mix in those takedowns. Now, on the Austen Hubbard side, this is going to be his second stint with the UFC. We just saw him come off of the Ultimate Fighter season 31, McGregor versus Chandler, which was last year. He was able to get 2 victories on the show, a dominant victory over a fighter named Aaron McKenzie by unanimous decision, and then he went to split decision with Roosevelt Roberts, which isn't too great, but regardless, he got his 2 wins and went to the finale to face Kurt Holobaugh in the UFC to make it back for the second time, where he did not look the best. He was subbed in the second round of that fight, but he looked super slow, and after watching Holobaugh get absolutely dominated by Trey Ogden in his last fight, that loss to Holobaugh does not look good for Hubbard. Now, like I said, this is his second stint with the UFC. The first one was from May 2019 to August 21, where he went 3-4 in that stretch. Now, watching his most recent fights, he does have that pressure in your face style. He's going to come forward. He's going to strike at all 3 levels. He likes to attack the head, body, and the legs, but he leaves his chin wide open. If he's the one initiating strikes, he is so hittable, and his opponents counter him very well. So, but if he's the one on the counter attack, I think he finds more success that way. But that's just not the way he fights. He's going to be in your face. But you go to the Michal Figlak side, and he is going to give Hubbard opportunity to counter because Figlak also has that in your face high pressure style. He's going to come forward, he's going to attack, he's going to mix in those takedowns as well. But the difference between Figlak is he doesn't have that, he doesn't go for traditional like single and double leg takedowns. He likes the body lock and trip. He likes to go forward, close the distance with some strikes, grab a hold of his opponents, lock up that back, and then swing his leg behind, get the trips, and just, whoop, getting too excited here. Get those trips and fall on top of his opponents. That's typically how he gets the takedowns. And he is extremely physically opposing. Look at the man's quads. I don't know if you can notice it in his picture right here, on the right over there, but the guy's quads are freaking massive. You'll see it in the fight on Saturday. The guy is super physically imposing, and if he finds himself in disadvantageous positions, I think that's a word. I'll go with it. If he finds himself in disadvantageous positions, he typically can muscle his way back to his feet from bottom position. Now, his two most recent fights, let me backtrack. He's 6-0 in the Cage Warriors promotion, which is a solid promotion out in the UK. A decent amount of fighters have moved over from there to the UFC. One that comes to mind, Paddy Pimblett. Regardless, undefeated in that promotion. Most recently, he went up against a fighter that is 15-3 named Sardari, and he dominated over 3 rounds. I think there was one moment in the first where Sardari landed a heavy shot that stunned Figlak, but beyond that, Figlak dominated that fight. Now, his UFC debut was 5 weeks after that, which he ended up losing. It was against Perez ZM, but it was 5 weeks after that Cage Warriors fight, and he took it on short notice. So, although Perez ZM isn't like top level, and like, to be honest, if you drop a fight against Perez ZM in your debut, it's not looking too good. But to be honest, Perez ZM has that weird, lanky, tricky style. So like I mentioned, 5 weeks difference between that Cage Warriors fight to his UFC debut, and it was on short notice. So we got to kind of take that loss with a grain of salt. Regardless, it's been quite some time. I don't know how long. I think it's been like a year and a little bit since we've seen Figlak in the UFC, or in his second fight, or in another fight since he's last fought, is what I'm trying to say. Jesus. Regardless, Figlak is only 27 years old, so that layoff, as long as he's been training, as long as he's been working on his skill set, I think he's going to come in here and defeat Austen Hubbard. I have been debating the Austen Hubbard side in this matchup. I've kind of been back and forth, but watching tape, watching these two fight, I think at this point in both of their careers, Figlak is better wherever the fight will end up, on the feet, on the mat, doesn't matter. I think Figlak will be the better fighter here and end up victorious at the end of 15 minutes. I'm going to say it goes to a decision on the Michael Figlak side. Moving on. We have a bantamweight fight against two savvy veterans. We have Rani Yahya going up against Victor Henry. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this fight because I see it being a dominant victory for Victor Henry here. Yahya is 39 years old now, and even though we have fighters older than Yahya that still find success, it's typically in the heavier weight classes. At bantamweight, 39 is like 47. I don't know if the math like translates there, but you guys understand what I'm getting at. Now, Henry is 36 years old, so it's not like he's some spring chicken that's way younger than Rani Yahya, but I think he's going to be able to win this fight. Rani Yahya has 21 career submissions, so he is clearly a dangerous grappler, but Victor Henry is, if anything, he is a high IQ fighter. He's going to know what Rani Yahya's win condition is, and that is to get him to the ground and submit him. Victor Henry has a solid almost 80% takedown defense in the UFC. I'm pretty sure that's over 3 or 4 fights, so it's not like a super, like, it's not like, it's kind of like what's the word I'm looking for? It's kind of a misleading number because he doesn't have that many fights, but he does have solid takedown defense, and Rani Yahya doesn't really have the best takedowns anyway. So I think Victor Henry's going to be smart enough here to realize that the only way he loses is if Yahya ends up getting it to the ground and submitting him. So Victor Henry is going to stay safe, stuff those takedowns, and he is super high volume. He has shown that in his 2 victories in the UFC, he posted 181 strikes against Raoni Barcelos, which is insane over 15 minutes. That's like a strike every 5 seconds landed. Insanity. In the Tony Gravely fight, he landed 154, so he is so high volume, and that's exactly what I see happening in this matchup. Rani Yahya is at 39 years old, just is coming off of a KO loss to Montel Jackson, and I just don't see him winning here. Unless, like I said, unless he gets the sub, but I don't think that's happening. Henry's going to stuff the takedowns. He's going to be extremely high volume against Yahya, overwhelm him with those strikes, and I think eventually will end up putting him away. I'm going to go Victor Henry by second half of the fight KO, so maybe like halfway through the second, halfway or nearing the end, or maybe third round. But I am going to go with a late Victor Henry KO against Rani Yahya. Moving on, we have a welterweight matchup against, speaking of veterans, we got Dirty Bird Tim Means going up against Uros Medic. I'm actually excited for this fight because Tim Means is an absolute dog. He's not going to be deterred easily. The guy's not going to get put away easily. And on the other side, we have an extremely crisp and technical kickboxer in Uros Medic. Now, I am going to pick Uros Medic in this fight. Tim Means is an absolute dog. We already mentioned this, but he is 40 years old right now. Despite that 40 years of age, he is coming off of a KO victory against Andre Fiallo back in September. That was actually my godbrother's wedding, and I ended up still streaming the fights and watching them. But it was a great fight. Me and my cousin had Tim Means beating Andre Fiallo because, as we know from Fiallo's UFC career, the guy has no chin. Now, I'm not taking anything away from that dub for Tim Means because at this age, that is a solid victory to have under your belt, but I don't think that's going to help him here in against Uros Medic. Medic is going to be the far better striker, and I would still say that even if Tim Means was like 32, 33 years old. Medic's technique on the feet is second to none. The guy's an absolute stud in the striking department. Now, if I was Tim Means, I would watch that Miktebek Orolbai fight that Uros Medic just had in November, and I would implement that same game plan. I would grapple, I would wrestle, exploit Medic's lack of defensive wrestling, and just smother him on the ground. But I don't see that happening. Tim Means is also a striker, and even though he can mix in those takedowns, I really don't see him doing it that often here in this matchup. And that's honestly going to be to his demise because Medic is going to be the crisper, faster, more technical striker, and I do believe that Medic will eventually find that shot that puts Tim Means away. 40 years old is getting up there. I know fighters can get away with it at these heavier weight classes, but typically like light heavyweight, not really welterweight. Regardless, I think Medic is going to finish. He's going to find that KO blow. I'm not going to say early on, even though it could happen, but I think it's going to. Tim Means is an absolute dog. We've already gone through this. I don't think he's going to be easily put away. So maybe like a late KO, a finish on the Medic side. We did see that Orolbai loss, and the reason why I bring that up for Tim Means is because I think that's the path to least resistance. But one thing I will say about that matchup, Uros Medic was training to fight Johnny Parsons in that originally for back in November. Now Johnny Parsons is a striker. The guy hasn't landed a takedown in the UFC, and I don't think he's even attempted one. I believe he has a Muay Thai striking style. Could be wrong. Regardless, he's training for a striker and a striker only. So for your training camp, there is no reason to waste time. Like, I understand it's an MMA fight. You should be well-versed in all aspects of mixed martial arts. I get that. And be prepared for anything. But against somebody like Johnny Parsons, you don't have to waste time in your camp working on the wrestling. So he worked on striking, blah, 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 blah. 3, 4 days, 5 days, whatever it was, all of a sudden, Johnny Parsons isn't fighting, and now Miktebek Orolbai comes in. No idea who this guy is. I'm sure Medic had the same. We know who he is now, but I'm sure Medic had the same reaction. No idea who this guy is. You see, he's from that part of the world that likes that wet blanket wrestling, wrestling heavy pressure style. And like, what are you gonna do in like 3-4 days? You're not gonna learn. You're not gonna be able to reverse everything you've been training over the past couple of months, right? So he goes in and absolutely starches Orobai, almost puts him away in the first round, but then tires out a little bit, gets wet blanketed, and eventually neck cranked, I believe it was, face crank, whatever you want to call it. I had Medic in that fight, so I'm pissed. Regardless, I'm going to take that fight also with a grain of salt because lack of preparation, short notice, whatever you want to call it. I don't see that happening here. Tim Means is going to get put away late on in this fight. He is a dog, though. Big fan. Let's move on. Uros Medic is my pick. All right, next up, we got a featherweight bout. Jonathan Pearce going up against David Onama. Now, I am fully aware that David Onama is going to be a very live underdog in this matchup. I had him to defeat Gabriel Santos in his last fight, where he put the man away with a uppercut in the clinch, I believe it was. Absolutely smoked him. Loved that. Anyway, I am going to pick Jonathan Pearce here. But this is your typical striker versus grappler / wrestler. Now, this fight is going to come down to who can implement their game plan better. And I understand that's the basis of getting a victory in fighting. But just because you implement your game plan doesn't always mean you're going to win. But whoever does it better in this matchup will win. This takes me to Jonathan Pearce's last fight against Joe Anderson Brito. Or Brito. Whatever. Jonathan Pearce was dominating that fight from the second that the first bell rang, or the ref said fight, up until he got freaking ninja choked. Jonathan Pearce was dominating. It was ragdolling Brito, putting in good work on the ground, implementing his heavy wrestling game plan. But one of the moments where Brito was pushing back up to his feet, he wrapped up the quickest freaking ninja choke I've ever seen in my life and tapped out Jonathan Pearce. I don't think David Onama has the grappling chops that Joe Anderson Brito does. I don't see that happening in this fight. And we know that David Onama struggles with that takedown defense as well. We've seen it. The one thing I will say, though, is David Onama is an absolute dog and will not give up on himself. He will not quit. And we saw a perfect example of that against Nate Landwehr. He did lose that fight by majority decision, but Nate Landwehr is also a dog. They were both dogs, but David Onama looked like he could die from exhaustion in that fight, and he would not stop fighting. So that is one thing I will say on the David Onama side, that even if Jonathan Pearce pressures him, wrestles him, ragdolls him, puts in that work on the mat, he will not go anywhere. He will continue fighting. He will not give up. And that's why I'm going to go with Jonathan Pearce to get a unanimous decision. I don't think he can put David Onama away. The only thing is, if by some chance Onama can fend off those takedowns and land some good shots on the feet, he's going to starch Jonathan Pearce. I have no faith in Jonathan Pearce's striking ability whatsoever. And like I said, this is just going to come down to whoever can implement their game plan. I believe Jonathan Pearce will be able to wrestle. I just think he's going to be able to take down David Onama whenever he wants, put in good work. Now, the one thing is, though, Jonathan Pearce does struggle to keep the fight on the ground. He averages almost 6 takedowns per fight, and typically he's getting all these takedowns because his opponents are getting back up to their feet. So hopefully he worked on his control a little bit. I completely understand that Onama is a live underdog in this matchup. I just believe that Jonathan Pearce will ride it out, wrestle him, and get that victory by unanimous decision. So I'm going with Jonathan Pearce here. Let's move on to the next fight. We have another heavyweight matchup. Austen Lane going up against Jhonata Diniz. And this is one of those heavyweight fights that you can actually use some sort of technical analysis. Now you have Jhonata Diniz, the shadow figure, right here. He is yet to get his UFC picture, so next time he fights, we will have an actual model of him there. But for right now, that's him. He is a former Glory Kickboxer, the same promotion that Alex Pereira is from, as we all know by now probably. He is making his UFC debut. He's only 6-0 in MMA, but all 6 of his wins were by KO. And all 6 of them were by KO in the first round. So the guy is absolutely starching people. I'm sure it's more low-level competition, but he is putting them away with ease. Now, he is coming off a KO victory, obviously, because he's only won by KO and he's never lost. But that was back on the Contender Series in September or August. I don't remember which month, but he was on last season of Dana White's Contender Series, and he flatlined Eduardo Neves, who is a solid prospect, so that was a good win to get under his belt. Now he's going up against Austen Lane. Similar to the frame of Dontel Mays, this guy is a massive human being. He's 6'6", has an 80-inch reach, and despite us talking about all of Diniz's KOs, Austen Lane has 12 career wins, and 11 of them are by KO. He's a former football player that transitioned into MMA, so he traded one sport that gives him CTE for another one. I guess he just wanted to switch it up a little bit. Regardless, he's 12-4 in his career, as we mentioned. But despite those 11 knockouts, all 4 of his losses have been him getting knocked out. So that's a little bit concerning. Now, he has 4 fights under the UFC umbrella, 2 Contender Series fights, and 2 fights in the actual promotion. Now, his Contender Series fights, his first one was way back in 2018 where he went up against Greg Hardy, also a former football player, but he got absolutely smoked in the first round of that fight. I think it was the first round. Regardless, he got absolutely pumped by Greg Hardy. And seeing now, 6 years later, we see how Greg Hardy's MMA career shaped out. That is a terrible loss to have on your record. Now, second time on the Contender Series was back in September of 2022, where he went up against a fighter called Richard Jacoby, who was 6-0-1 at the time, and Austen Lane ended up getting a first-round knockout in that Contender Series fight. But that's not without getting 2 or 3 sacks on Richard Jacoby in that fight as well, which obviously is going to alter the way the man fights. Regardless, he got the knockout. He also got the contract. And then we saw him in his debut against Justin Tafa. Both of his fights in the UFC are actually against Justin Tafa. The first time, Austen Lane freaking stuck his finger right in the man's eye, made him bleed. The guy couldn't see anything, so they had to call a no contest. And then they rebooked the fight. They went in there, and Justin Tafa knocked him out in less than a minute and a half. Just put his lights out as typical, or in typical Tafa brother fashion. Just boom! Knocked him out, flatlined him, and now he's going back into the octagon against another heavy-handed striker. Now, there's some unknowns on the Diniz side. Mostly, it's going to be how he does wrestling, how he does grappling, and how his cardio holds up in an MMA atmosphere if it gets out of that first round. We know he has a combat background and probably has good cardio in kickboxing, but we know watching MMA, wrestling, grappling, clinching, all of that works muscles that you're not really used to, especially coming from a kickboxing background. So if Austen Lane is smart, he will go into this fight with Diniz and put him in uncomfortable positions, clinch up with him, try to get takedowns, grapple, wear him down. Don't stand in the fire in the first round. But I can't trust that Austen Lane's going to do that. He has 11 KOs. The guy loves to strike. I don't blame him. He's 6'6". The guy's freaking massive. So I don't blame him. He has power. He wants to use it. But if he's smart, he will exploit the unknowns that we have for Jhonata Diniz's wrestling. I just can't trust that he does that, and I'm going to pick the more technical and better striker overall in a fight that I believe will stay on the feet. Now, Austen Lane is a decent-sized underdog. He is going to be live because it is a heavyweight match. One punch can change everything in a fight, especially in the heaviest weight class available. But I can't trust him to be durable enough. I can't trust him to grapple, wear down Diniz, and then maybe get a KO late. But I am going to go with Jhonata Diniz to put Lane's lights out. Let's move on. We got another women's fight. This is the third last fight. We got a women's flyweight matchup against Ariane Lipski and Karine Silva. And now I'm not typically excited. I'm not typically I don't typically get excited for watching women's MMA fights, but this fight I am excited for because both of these women are pretty exciting when they get into the octagon. We got Ariane Lipski on one side, 17-8. She's 6-5 in her UFC career, so it's been pretty lackluster, but she's managed to find herself on a 3-fight win streak against decent opponents. She beat JJ Aldrich, Melissa Gatto, and then most recently she submitted Casey O'Neill, which was a very solid prospect, in the second round in her most recent fight. Now she is taking on Karine Silva. She's an absolute killer, as her nickname suggests. She is called Karine Killer Silva. Now she has 17 wins, and all 17 of those are finishes. She has 8 KOs and 9 submissions. She's currently on an 8-fight win streak, and more impressively on a 6-fight submission streak. Insanity. She has solid striking with decent power. She moves well on the feet, but her grappling is where she shines. She has some of the best grappling that I've seen, especially in the women's MMA world. But the only thing I will say about her, sorry, my nose is itchy. One thing I will say about her is she accepts bottom position too much because she is such a good grappler. If she gets taken down, she stays on her back, and typically she is able to set up her opponents to fall into her traps and submit them. So I don't blame her for not minding being in that position, but the problem is if she can't find that submission, she is going to be burning the clock. The rounds will get away from her, and unless she's doing good damage, the judges are going to see her on bottom and that she's at a disadvantage, and if she can't find the submission, I'm just worried that if Lipski does decide to grapple and stay safe enough, that Silva will just keep trying to throw up subs. I think she'll be able to find a sub if she does that, but there is the possibility. Anyway, so that's one thing I will say about a little knock on the Karine Silva side. Now Lipski, she likes ending her combos with kicks. We see it in most of her fights, especially recently, but she has mostly a boxing style. She has that nice tight guard. She plots forward and throws 2 to 3 punches at a time, which is great, and she actually has decent power for a women's flyweight fighter. She does have good enough grappling as well to threaten her opponents on the feet, but it is going to be nowhere near the ability to Karine Silva, and if I'm Lipski, I avoid the ground at all costs in this fight. Now, I am really high on Karine Silva. I think she's going to be fighting for a title soon in her career, so I am going to be picking her in this matchup. I think her movement on the feet is going to keep her safe from that plodding forward, the heavy hands of Ariane Lipski, that boxing style. I think she's going to be able to move around, find her spots, and if the fight does get to the ground, I believe she's going to be able to submit Ariane Lipski. So I am going to go with Karine Silva to get a submission at some point in this fight. Maybe club and sub style. We'll see. But I will be going with Karine Silva. Let's go on to the co-main event. Make sure to like and hit that subscribe button for more UFC content. We get into the light heavyweight division for our co-main event. We got Ryan Spann going up against Bogdan Guskov. Now, I'm not going to go too in-depth here, but Ryan Spann is the better fighter in this matchup, and he should win. But I am going to be picking Bogdan Guskov because you just can't trust Ryan Spann. He's unreliable, and he seems to find his losing condition in fights that he should win. His two most recent fights are perfect examples of that. In his last fight, he fought Anthony Smith for the second time. Earlier on in his career, he lost by submission to Anthony Smith. They decided to run it back because of where they both were in their current careers. And this guy had Anthony Smith dead to rights in that second round, but he literally almost had him finished, but he didn't capitalize. He didn't try hard enough to get Anthony Smith out of there, and proceeded to go into that third round and do absolutely nothing and cruise to a split decision loss. Okay? Should have won that fight. The fight before that, Nikita Krylov, very solid top 10 fighter in the light heavyweight division. I'm not taking anything away from Krylov, but Ryan Spann, being the absolute huge human being that he is, he has the advantage on the feet, all right? If he stays on the feet with Krylov, he is going to have the advantage striking. He has the power to basically KO anybody, in my opinion. But he decided to entertain the grappling against Krylov, who is the better grappler, all right? Although it made for a very exciting first and only round in that fight, there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of scrambles in the grappling exchanges. It was super fun to watch, but the problem is he gassed himself out. He shook off Krylov off of his back at one point in that fight. Krylov lands on his back on the mat, and Ryan Spann jumps on top of him to try to start putting in work, and he literally falls right into a freaking triangle choke and immediately tapped. You knew he was gassed because it was almost immediate. Literally lands, triangle choke, taps. I just get super frustrated because I had Ryan Spann against Krylov to win. Okay? I also had him to beat Anthony Smith. All right? The guy's unreliable. I can't trust him. And now he's 7-4 in the UFC. I know I said I wasn't going to spend too much time on, but I'm on a tangent. I'm going to keep going. He's 7-4 in the UFC. All right? But I understand getting 7 wins in the UFC is impressive. Who am I to talk? I've never even been in a fist fight before. I'm sure it's very challenging to get a fight anywhere. Never mind 7 of them in the best promotion in the world. Regardless, those fights are not impressive, or the wins are not impressive. He beat some guy named Henrique who is 2-4 in the UFC. 42-year-old Minotauro Nogueira. Okay, well past his prime. Devin Clark, who was 8-9 in the UFC, all right? A split decision win over Sam Alvey. That is disgusting. Disgusting. After that, he gets a win over Misha Serkinov. He is no longer in the UFC. He has a win over Kutalaba. 6-9-1 in the UFC. Disgusting. All right? And a washed Dominic Reyes who has no chin left. All right, those are Ryan Spann's wins. Now, the way I'm talking is like Guskov has some good wins too. Guskov, on the other hand, he's 15-3. He has 13 KOs, but he's crushing cans. He's fighting absolutely nobody, so that is kind of an inflated record. Nevertheless, he's getting those KOs. This is going to be his 3rd fight in the UFC. His first fight was a short notice debut fight against Ozdemir, and you can't really discredit the guy in his abilities for losing that fight. All right. Ozdemir is a tough challenge for any current UFC light heavyweight, never mind a newcomer making his debut on short notice at that. Now, he had his moments in that fight. It didn't last very long. He got choked out super early. I get that. But he did put up a good fight. He got exhausted quick, ended up getting choked out after getting dropped. Regardless, we move on to his next UFC fight against Zach Pauga. Zach Pauga was hitting him. He was outstriking him, and he was landing pretty well. Guskov's got a low-handed style. He's like a light heavyweight Bobby Green. I don't want to say it like that because he does keep his hands up sometimes. But Pauga was landing. He landed good shots in that fight. But ultimately, Pauga got stumbled, and then he got hit and was like leaning over. I don't know if he was like out on his feet, but anyway, Guskov, while Pauga was hunched over, hit boom, 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 like 3 more shots, tumbled Pauga over, knocked him out clean cold. But despite that being a good KO, Zach Pauga is not UFC caliber in my opinion, so you got to take that win with a grain of salt as well. Now, the point of me bringing this all up to you is I don't think Guskov is the better fighter. I just, at this point, cannot trust Ryan Spann to make the right decision and to get that win. I am going to go with Guskov. This is the first and literally the only underdog that I've picked. So, Karine Silva did start off as the underdog, though, and the Caio Machado-Dontel Mace fight, it's almost a pick-em, but this is the only true underdog at this point that I am picking, which makes me a little nervous. But that moves us into the main event of the evening. It is Matthias Nicolau going up against Alex Perez, and this is another short notice fight. We got Alex Perez coming in to replace Manel Kape in this matchup. Now, I am going to pick Matthias Nicolau, surprisingly enough. Now, the reason why I'm doing this is because watching his fights, he is very fundamentally sound. Now, this may not be the most exciting style for people, but he does what he needs to do to win. He has good movement. He doesn't put himself in the fire. He doesn't put himself in danger very often. He minds his P's and Q's, and he gets those dubs. He's 7-2 in the UFC, and beyond 2 big shots, he is perfect in the promotion. His only 2 losses come from getting tagged by something powerful that ends up stumbling him and getting him put away. Back in 2018, he fought Dustin Ortiz that landed a head kick that led to his led to a TKO loss. And in his most recent fight, I believe 10 months ago, something along those lines, Brandon Royval landed a beautifully placed knee that just stunned Nicolau and put him away. And I just don't think that Alex Perez has that one shot in him to stumble Nicolau and put him away. Now, on the Alex Perez side, he's taking this fight on short notice, which we already mentioned. He's only fought 3 times in the past since 2020, and he's lost all 3 of those fights. Most recently, it was a fight against Muhammad Makayev that was like 5 weeks ago. Super quick turnaround. He ended up losing that fight by unanimous decision. But his prior 2, because like I said, he's fought 3 times in the past 4 years. He's lost all 3 of those fights. Now, mind you, Makayev was his most recent, but the 2 before that was against Pantoja, current champion of the division, and Davison Figueiredo, former champion of the division, and he got choked out in the first round in both of those fights. So you can kind of give him a pass there regardless. He hasn't had his hand raised since 2019 or something. Short notice, I've said this, and I just can't pick him in this matchup where everything is stacked against him. I believe that he's doing the UFC a favor here by taking this on short notice in hopes that he gets into the good graces of the UFC and they keep him around even though he's strung together all of these losses. That is basically my breakdown. I believe Matthias Nicolau is the better fighter anyway. I just think he's going to be too fundamentally sound. I don't think Perez has that finishing ability. And I think that Matthias Nicolau will eventually tire out Perez and get a submission victory. I'm going to go a 3rd round submission victory for Nicolau. Now that is my breakdown for UFC Vegas 91. Guys, I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like, comment, and hit that subscribe button for more UFC content. I hope you guys enjoy the fights. I will see you in the next video.